Alô? Tá. Boa tarde. Sejam bem-vindas e bem-vindos à mesa de encerramento da terceira jornada de estudos sobre Henry James e do primeiro simpósio de estudos sobre Realismo e Modernismo. A organização da jornada e do simpósio é uma iniciativa do grupo de pesquisa Núcleo de Estudos sobre Henry James, e agradecemos ao apoio técnico do LERO, Laboratório de Estudos do Romance, que tem sido essencial para a viabilização das transmissões do evento, e também pelo apoio institucional da CAPES, bem como do programa e do Departamento de Teoria Literária e Literatura Comparada. Mas agora, com a presença do Miraldo aqui, eu preciso também agradecer muito ao Lapel, que sem eles não poderíamos fazer essas transmissões. O know-how do Lapel foi essencial. É também com muito prazer que eu apresento para essa nossa mesa de encerramento o poeta, escritor, professor da PUC-Rio, tradutor, crítico literário e um dos mais recentes membros da Academia Brasileira de Letras, Paulo Henriques Britto. Entre seus livros de poesia estão Macau, Formas do Nada, Nenhum Mistério e de contos O Castiçal Florentino, entre muitas outras obras. Ele é tradutor de mais de 100 obras de autores, é impressionante, mais de 100. 130 obras de autores como William Faulkner, Elizabeth Bishop, Byron, Jane Austen, Dickens, John Updike, George Orwell, Philip Roth, Thomas Pynchon, Wallace Stevens e Naples. De Henry James ele traduziu Pelos Olhos de Maisie, a versão do título dele, única aqui no Brasil, para o What Maisie Knew. A Outra Volta do Parafuso, os contos reunidos no volume A Morte do Leão, Histórias de Artistas e Escritores, e a ser lançado muito em breve, essa é uma notícia muito recente, que eu fiquei sabendo com muita felicidade também, As Asas da Pomba. Paulo recebeu os prêmios Portugal Telecom, APCA, Alfonso de Guimarães, 2 vezes, Alceu Amoroso Lima, Bravo, Prime de Literatura e Jabuti. Hoje ele vai falar sobre Henry James na palestra The Role of Absence in Henry James Fiction, na qual ele investiga o papel de James na virada da forma romanesca e dos 800 para a ficção modernista de Proust, Kafka e Woolf. Em especial, ele examina a categoria da ausência como constitutiva de sua narrativa. Paulo, isso foi o que eu entendi, depois você me corrija, tá, se eu estou falando bobagem. Um tipo de procedimento que também podemos encontrar, de algum modo, na obra madura do seu contemporâneo Machado de Assis.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of the event. I apologize for my terrible voice and my incessant cough. Also, I must apologize for not being a James scholar. I'm not really a specialist on fiction. What I do mostly is study poetic form, translation of poetry, and literary translation in general. So I should really, by rights, make some sort of comment on my translations of James, which this is my original intention, really. But when you start writing a piece of text, whatever it is, not just fiction, it sort of takes a life of its own. And then I realized that I wasn't writing about translation at all. I was writing about the role of absence in James's fiction. So here goes. I'm not conversant with current James studies or anything, so maybe what I'm saying here is something that has been said before and much better than I can say it. So I just have to apologize for this, and stop me if you heard this one before, okay? Okay, here goes. There's a short scene in Tolstoy's War and Peace in chapter 9 of book 14 that is by no means one of the most important of the book, but has remained vividly etched in my memory, even though I only read the novel once over 40 years ago, believe it or not. 2 Russian officers, members of the nobility, and therefore pitch-perfect French speakers, somehow get hold of a couple of French uniforms. They infiltrate a position of the French, posing as stragglers from a unit of Napoleon's army. They ask a few questions and manage to gather important information. The suspense is intense. If the true identities of the infiltrators are discovered, they of course will be shot immediately. The novel's omniscient narrator allows us full access to all the details of the narrative, We know precisely what is going on. The French officers are somewhat suspicious, but not enough to act on their suspiciousness. And as we read the episode, we become accomplices of the Russians. But though the passage is suspenseful, the reader somehow feels that the narrator has access to all aspects of the situation, even if he does not reveal everything at once. The narrator knows how the scene is going to end and is simply holding back this particular information for his own reasons. The 19th century novel, which may have reached its most consummate form in Tolstoy's work, is epistemologically nothing if not ambitious. The point is not just that the narrator is omniscient, but that the model of the world posited by Tolstoy's fiction is complete and capable of being known in its entirety. Tolstoy's narrator, like God, sees everything and knows everything about a world that is completely knowable and inexhaustible because it was created by him. And naturally, it is presented as a trustworthy image of the real world. This is the purpose of the narrator's essayistic innovations throughout the novel. In these texts, we are taught the true meaning of history and the correct way to write history. However complex the mishaps of war, the relations between men and women, all human relationships, it is possible to grasp and understand it all and to form well-founded judgments on it. The effect of such a worldview can only be reassuring. Let us compare the episode from War and Peace with one from Henry James's novella, The Turn of the Screw. The narrator, a governess whose name we never learn, has been hired to look after two orphan children, a boy and a girl, who live in a country house. Their legal guardian, an uncle, lives in London and has pretty much washed his hands of his young charges. For reasons that are never made clear, the boy has just been expelled from his boarding school. Before long, at odd moments, the narrator sees two strangers, a man and a woman, in different parts of the property. She describes them to the housekeeper, who identifies them in shock as two ill-reputed servants who used to work in the house and have since died. But only the narrator sees these apparitions. The housekeeper doesn't see them, not even in a crucial scene in which the two women are together. From this point on in the story, the suspicion grows that the narrator is suffering from hallucinations. But the situation gets even more complex in a passage beginning in chapter 15, in which the governess describes another encounter with a woman's ghost. She shouts at the apparition, which, as before, says nothing before it vanishes in thin air. In the next chapter, however, the narrator describes to the housekeeper the scene we have just witnessed, and in this version of the events, addressed to the uneducated and gullible servant, the apparition talks back to her, confessing that she suffers the horrors of the damned and that her intention is to drag the little girl to hell with her. At this crucial moment in the story, the reader realizes that the narrator, whether or not she is a victim of hallucinations, is clearly a liar. The entire story we're reading is being told by this person. Our distrust is now complete. We don't have any alternative source. We read this tale until the terrible end without knowing how much of what we're reading is supposed to be real in the alternative world of fiction. In the War and Peace episode discussed earlier, the reader witnesses an act of espionage. Two infiltrated Russian officers pose as Frenchmen. We're confident that we know exactly what is happening in the fictional universe, because the narrator is omniscient and apparently speaking in good faith, though he shares his knowledge with us only gradually as he sees fit. Reading The Turn of the Screw, we realize that not only is the illiterate housekeeper being deceived, but we ourselves are perhaps being duped by the untrustworthy governess. In this fictional universe, there is no benevolent God to vouch for the veracity of the story being told. We're entirely reliant on a narrator who, before our very eyes, contradicts what she herself has just said. A brief parenthesis is in order here. The Turn of the Screw came out in 1898. 2 years later, in Brazil, Machado de Assis published Dom Casmurro, a novel with a narrator as unreliable as the governess in James's novella, though for different reasons. There's a passage in Dom Casmurro that in some ways can be compared to the scene from The Turn of the Screw we have just examined. It is chapter 135, titled Othello. In it, the narrator, Bentinho, goes to the theater and watches a performance of Shakespeare's tragedy. As he walks home at the end of the show, Bentinho reflects, if Othello strangled his wife, even though she was innocent, what if she was, quote, guilty as Capitu, and what death would the Moor give her, unquote. But Bentinho's reasoning makes no sense. Obviously, Othello doesn't know that Desdemona is innocent, and therefore he wouldn't give her a different death if she were really guilty. Bentinho's obtuseness and jealousy are such that far from realizing that he's exactly in Othello's position, he leaves the theater more convinced than ever of Capitu's guilt. When you reread the book today, what surprises you is that it was only decades after its publication that critics began to question Bentinho's reliability as a narrator. Of course, the person who realized that Bentinho is not to be trusted was an American critic, a woman called Helen Caldwell, I think. And this was like 30, 40 years after the book was published. And nobody had realized this in Brazil. It's amazing. The 60s. In the 60s, yeah, in the 60s, you're right, 60 years after the publication. This is amazing. Reading the book after that, says, how can people have been taken in so long, you know? Absurd. That's the way it is. The essential difference between James's and Tolstoy's narratives has to do with the image of the world that we get from these two authors. If in Tolstoy, the totality of the world can be properly encompassed, understood, and evaluated, James's fiction projects the image of a world that is incompletely glimpsed, with all kinds of opaque facets. Whether the narrating voice is a character in the story or an entity outside the action, their vision is inevitably partial, limited, incomplete. What's more, in these narratives, what often occupies an important, even central position in the plot is precisely an absence, indicating that the world is too complex and unknowable to be rationally apprehended and represented, let alone judged. James's fiction places us in a universe that is, in this respect, radically different from Tolstoy's, where once there was a totality capable of being captured by human knowledge, peopled by human beings with intentions and sentiments that can be exhaustively described, analyzed, and evaluated, we now have a world marked by opacities and ambiguities, where not only the characters cannot be fully known, but also absences play decisive roles. Let's look at two more examples. In The Jolly Corner, Spencer Brighton, a man who grew up in New York City but has chosen to live his adult life abroad, returns to his hometown and to the house where he lived when he was young, now unfurnished and uninhabited. He dedicates himself to the task of renovating another building he owns, and finding he is better at this sort of thing than he had expected, Spencer begins to fantasize about the person he could have been if he had stayed in New York instead of emigrating, and gradually comes to realize that his old house is haunted by a specter, not the ghost of a dead person, but a double of himself, the person he would have become if, instead of going abroad, he had remained at the house where he grew up. And this alter ego, Spencer Brighton as he would be if he had remained in New York and had fully developed his entrepreneurial talents, is an ugly, tormented, physically maimed creature, the sight of which horrifies the actual Spencer to such an extent that he passes out. Thus, the spectral existence of a possible world, a potential never actualized, lives on in a specific place, the house where he would have stayed if he hadn't decided to move to Europe. The whole plot revolves around Spencer's absence from this house. This unactualized reality is also a part of a world that cannot possibly be conceived, let alone grasped in its entirety. Our final example of the centrality of absence, this time without involving any sort of spectral beings, is The Wings of the Dove, one of James's greatest achievements in his final period, in my humble opinion. In the novel, Kate Croy and Merton Dancer become secretly engaged, but do not have enough money to marry. Millie Thiel, a young American visiting London, heiress to an immense fortune with no living relatives, conveniently, discovers that she has an incurable and fatal disease. Kate, who has become close to her, realizes that Millie had previously met Merton in New York and has fallen in love with him. She devises an ambitious plan. Merton will approach Millie, and eventually the two will marry. After Millie dies, Merton will inherit her fortune, which he'll then share with Kate. The plot seems to work fine for a while, but just before she dies, Millie finds out what is going on. She's estranged from Merton. Nevertheless, she still bequeaths a small fortune to her self-interested suitor. In the final chapters of the novel, Millie, although dead, continues to play a central role in the plot. Merton then refuses to collect the money she left him in her will and will marry Kate only if she also refuses it. He also says he will accept the inheritance and transfer it to her if she so wishes. But in that case, they will separate. Kate doesn't accept either alternative, and the engagement falls apart. The wings of the absent dove are still spread over the living and exert a decisive influence over their lives. A figure in which presence and absence merge, the ghost occupies a prominent position in several of James's works. There are a number of ghost stories we could mention, such as The Way It Came, later renamed The Friends of the Friends, one of my favorites, as well as other narratives in which absence is central but no ghosts appear. However, the examples we have discussed should suffice. All three have in common is a fundamental uncertainty as to what can be said about the world. In The Turn of the Screw, the existence of the ghosts that supposedly possess or attempt to possess the two children is exposed as doubtful from the start, even more so when the narrator is shown to be a liar. All the same, the ghosts play a determining role in a plot that culminates with the death of one of the children. In The Jolly Corner, reality is presented as just one possible world among others that could have come true, while another unactualized possible world has a ghostly existence in an uninhabited house, or an otherwise uninhabited house. This unrealized potential reality can be grasped only partially through a fateful encounter with the spectral presence of Spencer's double. In The Wings of the Dove, the reader seems to be on more solid ground. The third-person narrator here is divided mostly between the consciousnesses of Kate and of Merton, and events are reported in a much less ambiguous way than in the other two narratives. But the death of Millie, a character we mostly see from outside, doesn't rob her of her power over the others. On the contrary, her decision to leave a fortune to Merton, even though she knows he never loved her, brings about the end of his engagement to Kate. In fact, the bequest to Merton turns out to be the most perfect revenge Millie could have devised. If she had instead decided to disinherit him, the couple's relative poverty might only have had the effect of postponing their union. Although absent from the plot, Millie continues to determine the course of events. Let us return to the comparison with the 19th century novel with which we began this discussion. In Tolstoy, as in Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Turgenev, or in so many others, the fictional universe is a complete world that can be grasped, described, and crucially judged by the narrator. The narrator reveals only what he or she has a strategic interest in revealing, but it seems clear from the outset that it would be possible for him or her to disclose everything, including the secrets of all the characters. In most cases, as the plot unfolds, the fictional universe is described in ever greater detail, so that in the end, all that is relevant is known and the characters can be morally evaluated. This evaluation can sometimes take place in the most conventional, conservative terms. We are reminded of the passage from The Art of Fiction, in which James refers to the humorous condescension to, quote, the distribution at the last of prizes, pensions, husbands, wives, babies, millions. This is wonderful, unquote. That marks the happy ending of works considered good, meaning virtuous. In other authors, such as George Eliot, the moral growth of the central characters is not necessarily associated with happiness or any sort of material gain. A good example of this is the ending of Middlemarch. In Tolstoy's best period, and even in some works of his final phase, somewhat marred by the author's religious obsession, the moral at the end of the work certainly does not imply a trivial rewarding of the good and punishment of the bad. But in all these works, complete knowledge of the fictional world is assumed to be possible, and at the end of the narrative, there's always a moral reckoning of some sort. In Henry James, as in the mature works of Machado de Assis, when there is a third-person narrator, no moral evaluation is proposed at the end of the story, not because the narrator adopts an explicitly amoral stance, but simply because he or she does not claim godlike status, being aware of the gaps that are inevitable from any point of view. In many situations, James seems to be telling us, we simply lack the necessary data that would allow us to have a complete grasp of reality. This is the meaning of the absences that sometimes play a fundamental role in the plot. And if we are aware of our ignorance, how can we claim the right to judge? Because he mistakenly claims this right, Benchin comes dangerously close to committing suicide or killing his own son or both. The insecurity of the narrator in the later works of James and Machado de Assis underscores the end of the epistemological certainties underpinning the 19th century novel and paves the way for the radical limitations of the narrative voice in modern fiction. For instance, in Proust, Albertine, for all that the narrator keeps her a virtual prisoner in his house, remains an unknown quantity to the end. In fact, his possession of Albertine, the object of his desire, has the effect of divesting her of all the attractiveness she had before she became his prisoner. Possession here does not imply greater knowledge and has the additional effect of destroying desire. In Kafka, we're explicitly alerted to the impossibility of making sense of what is going on. In Der Bau, pardon my German, The Burrow, his last story, the animal narrator cannot see what's going on at every point of the underground structure it is building for its own use, and is faced with an insoluble dilemma. The more entrances and exits it adds to the burrow, the easier it is to escape a predator, but at the same time, the easier it is for a predator to find its way into the burrow. Complete knowledge of the world, even if that world is reduced to the burrow of a small animal, is impossible. And evaluation is just as impracticable, because every tentative solution brings about its own additional disadvantages. Of the major 20th century novelists, the one that comes closest to the Tolstoyan project is, of course, James Joyce. Ulysses, like War and Peace, projects a complex and comprehensive fictional universe. But the differences between the two could not possibly be overlooked. The world of Ulysses is not seen from a static and coherent viewpoint. It is a fractured, unstable universe, pieced together by a multiplicity of heterogeneous voices, and there is no ultimate meaning or redeeming moral at the end. Nothing more definite than the closing yes that points to an acceptance of reality such as it is, however chaotic and incompletely known. The reader of The Wings of the Dove will probably find Kate's plan immoral. As for Merton, he will probably be judged both immoral and pusillanimous, in that he submits to a plan that he himself finds ethically dubious at best. But Millie's final decision leads to an ending full of ambiguities, and the third-person narrator does nothing to help the reader draw conclusions and make judgments. What does Kate's final refusal indicate about her love for Merton? And if Merton rejects Millie's inheritance, is it because he has finally been overcome by moral scruples? Or is his decision motivated by a vague fear that the dove's wings have now turned into a kind of curse, fatefully associated with the money from the inheritance? We don't know. Just as we don't know whether Millie's final decision was determined by her love for Merton or her desire for revenge, or perhaps both. The readers of War and Peace are given a complete fictional universe, offered as an accurate reflection of the real world. And this fictional universe comes with an exposition of the correct view of history and a series of well-argued value judgments, though, of course, the reader can always question or reject this vision and these judgments. But once you finish reading one of James's narratives, the impression which you get is quite different. You feel as if you had lived through an experience in real life which you can only grasp in a partial, incomplete way without knowing how it was experienced by other subjects, and unable to pass definitive value judgments on the agents involved. It is precisely the uncertainty of these perceptions that gives us a profound sense of reality. Thank you.
I must say you're too modest. There's lots of things here to think about, and it's an incredible lecture. And one of the things that if I understood it right, that deals with this piece that you just presented has to be with the epistemology, this kind of, we can know, what can we know about the world, the narrator, the author, something that was certain, and then more or less it gets more precarious. And the other thing is the reader, because the reader is not on, he has to navigate in this very precarious world that is being told to him and make decisions. Is the governess guilty of trying to impose a very nasty hallucination that she has, or view that she has upon the children, and bringing that to them, or she's seeing these things? There's a debate as well. And with Machado de Assis as well, we have this debate over Dom Casmurro. I'm thinking too that the narrator, the governess, is a first-person narrator, and then, but in the wings of in the What Maisie Knew that you translated as well, it's a so-called third-person narrator. But the narrator, as Maisie grows, he can't really follow what she knows. At the end, he doesn't know what she knows. Yeah, but that's gradual. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. And you said one thing that's very provocative. What can be said about the world? But you were referring to the world in the narratives, perhaps. But I'm thinking also about the world of those two, James and Machado. What's going on in that society, in that modernity that makes them deal with something happens there, and we can't have a certainty no more about anymore about what's going on in this very complete world that Tolstoy used to give us, for instance, or George Eliot and the Dickens, as you said. And then, of course, we have in the 20th century Proust and Kafka, and the thing or Joyce, and the thing goes on. So, that's part of my question. But I'm thinking, as you said, Machado and James, do you think we can give a straight answer to, well, there's something about modernity, let's say, that they are contemporary to each other? Machado de Assis here in Brazil, James in Europe, but he's American, so something that's going on in modern times, and that's an answer? Or do you think we have to look into the very specific society Machado was living in Rio de Janeiro as well, and what James was, his decision to leave the United States for Europe, and his arrival in 1970s in France, and his talking to the realist vanguard of Flaubert, and I don't know. Can we give a straight answer, or there's something in the world that's like that, or can we have to say, well, we have to be specific to each of those authors, or both? So I don't know if I made myself clear.
Well, of course, there are specificities about a writer living in Rio de Janeiro and a writer shifting back and forth between the U.S. and England, and also the continent, as they say. But I think that there is a general point that can be made, and it has to do with epistemology more than anything else. What the 19th century novel reveals is two things that are going to change. One, that it's possible to write as if you had access to this. I mean, I'm writing a book. I have access to all that I'm writing. I devise these characters. I project a world, and I can possibly describe everything that is in this world. This is within my possibilities. And second, that this world that I'm projecting, that I'm devising, is a true reflection of the world. And of course, this varies from one author to another. But in the case of Tolstoy, I really think he believes that his projected fictional world is an adequate mirror of the real world. And when he says something about this fictional world, he's saying something about the real world, which he thinks is true, objectively true. Again, this has to do with aspects maybe not only of Tolstoy's own personality, but also this tendency of Russian major figures of Russian history to be know-all and end-all. You know, they're all like that. Maybe a characteristic of what Marx called, what was Marx for Oriental despotism, you know, whatever. But there is something to do with the 19th century belief in the ability to tell everything about the world, to have a true image of the world, which to us, living as we do now in the 21st century, it seems a hopelessly naive vision of the world. And the thing about Machado de Assis and Henry James and other contemporaries, that they, ahead of their time, a bit ahead of the time, I think, they anticipate what's going to happen in the 20th century, which is, I think the World War I was the point at which this whole thing crystallized, and that we have no control, that we have no true knowledge of the totality of the world. We don't know how everything works. And, you know, like Marx says, that everything turns to dust, everything crumbles. All these sharply defined realities, they all crumble into dust before our very eyes. So I think it's basically a transition from 19th century belief in the ability to make sense of the world with the 20th century suspiciousness about all such attempts to say everything about everything, you know.
So, questions? Paul, is there? And then Paul and Luisa.
Thank you very much for this very fascinating and provocative and very talk with lots of implications. Just one fact you might be interested in about the history of reception of the Turn of the Screw. James said in his preface to the Turn of the Screw, "My values are positively all blanks." And he said he didn't want to say what the villains had done because that would just give the reader more room to fill in the horror. And the initial reception of the Turn of the Screw, the newspaper reviews said, "Don't give this as a Christmas present to your children because it's too horrifying." But it wasn't until the 1930s with Edmund Wilson, who you've translated, came up with a psychoanalytic reading of the Turn of the Screw, that people started to think that the governess was mad. So for a good 30-some years, the prevalent reading was, this is a ghost story. And it wasn't until this gestalt shift that Wilson, and pointed out some of the things that you...
Machado de Assis, same situation.
Yeah, so it's very, very parallel, interestingly. Yeah. So James, I think, was very much aware of this. And he wrote in a late essay on Conrad. He appreciated Conrad because Conrad gloried in a gap. And the gaps can be used for various purposes. Some of them to create an illusion of realism. Nothing can ever be told completely. There's always the things that are left out. And James said in his lecture on Balzac that we were talking about earlier, that he gave in the 1905, 1906, 1904, 1905 trip to Europe, the problem with Balzac is that he tried to fill in too many details. He said Balzac sometimes obscured his picture from lighting too many matches. So saying less actually allows you to say more, and I would think that that's possibly also the case with Tolstoy. So, some of my favorite passages in Tolstoy, and Anna Karenina, for example, are where things are not said. The lovely scene between Levin and Kitty, where he proposes to her and she accepts, where they just have letters that they write on the tablecloth, not specified. And it's the imagination of each and the other, the wonderful scene, the unsaid is what allows us to come to life. But it seems to me also that absences can be used for other purposes of the sort that you pointed out, that could leave all sorts of differences for interpretation. But I'm working up to a question. I wonder whether for writers, this virtual dimension of their texts, what's unsaid, the indeterminacies, are absolutely crucial for the ability of their texts to live on. Because only if there's a space for us as readers to fill in differently can their works continue to seem to create worlds that are real, or enigmas, puzzles for us to figure out that are intriguing. James Joyce said of Ulysses, I've put so many enigmas and puzzles into it that it'll take the professors centuries to figure it out, and that's how you maintain immortality. I'm wondering whether the ultimate role of absences in fiction, whether they're serving to create an illusion of verisimilitude or to give us things to think about the indeterminacies of the world that we live in, the conflict of interpretations, that the ultimate purpose of these absences is to leave room for the reader, space for the reader to engage works without which the author's works can't live on. So thank you.
Well, it could be, but I don't know. I'm thinking of George Eliot, who's by far the most intelligent, I think, of the Victorian novelists in English. And I'm thinking of Balzac, and I'm thinking also of what Marx said about Balzac. I learned more about history reading Balzac than reading all history books. So there is this 19th century feeling. Sorry. There's this whole way of thinking in the 19th century that, in theory at least, everything is knowable, everything is sayable. Of course, there are gaps. You can find gaps in everyone, even in Tolstoy. But I don't think these gaps are purposeful. I think they're left there because ultimately what they're trying to do is impossible. But I think their ultimate goal, I'm thinking of, again, of Balzac writing his intention was to write a series of novels. Of course, he died in the middle of his project, but writing a series of novels that gave a complete and accurate description of what France was like during the Second Empire, right? So I don't know. And actually, it was before the Second Empire, right? Yeah, before, yeah. So there was an intention there to say everything about everything, and the gaps, I don't think they were meaningful. I mean, they were not intentional. Even, of course, you can find them in Balzac. You can find them in even in Tolstoy. And the difference, I think, is that the coming modernists, and here Machado de Assis and Henry James seem to be pre-moderns. They seem to point to modernity. And what I think the basic difference is that in the modernist period, in the early 20th century, and I insist, immediately after the impact of World War I, all of these 19th century certainties seem suspect. And nobody could really expect to say everything that is possible to be said about the world and to get a complete mixture of the world. I think there's also science too, right? When you think of the basic difference between Newtonian physics and the chemistry of the up to the 19th century, and then Einstein and the chemistry of Planck and the other, I mean, the basic things about the world is that you cannot say, if you know the position of a particle, you cannot say where exactly, how far the particle is moving, and if you fix the speed of the particle, then you don't know where exactly the particle is. And the point is, it's not that you can only capture this impression. If you know the speed of a particle, then you can't possibly know the position of the particle. No, according to physicists, once you fix the position of the particle, it no longer has a stable speed. If you fix the speed of a particle, it no longer is in a special in a particular position in space, which would sound completely unbelievable. In fact, it did seem unbelievable for Einstein. Einstein never accepted modern chemistry. He said, God does not play with dice, God does not throw dice, something like that. So I think there's a whole change of mentality here. And artists, I think they did this before the scientists. They did this before the historians. They were the first to come to this conclusion. It's not exactly a conclusion, inkling, rather, through intuition, through artistic intuition. And when the next generation came, they of course, they had already the wave paved for them. These people were trailblazers. They really started something which in the 20th century became more general. And I think that the basic difference, again, I insist, is epistemological. What can be said about the world? How far we can actually know about the world?
I have a question related to Marcelo's question about modernity and related to God. But before that, just that. I was remembering about. I remember while you were talking about another James novella or story, The Beast in the Jungle. In which the absence, this dialectic between absence and presence is very important. And the character also dies. And after she dies, she's a present, much more present for the main character. He
realizes that she's the present.
Exactly.
When she's really absent, then he realized that she was the present.
So, but my question is, if this non-reliable narrator in James and Machado is related to their secularized, can we say secularized attitude toward religion, a Nietzschean attitude, or attitude and also epistemology, that make we think that they are narrating a world in which God is absent. For Tolstoy, God was very much present.
And his name was Tolstoy.
He was transcendent. But you said that his narrator his third-person narrator was omniscient as a God. And maybe we can say that about Balzac also, or George Eliot, I don't know. But this first-person, non-reliable Machado's and James narrator makes the non-reliability makes God absence. I don't know if it's a modern attitude toward religion.
No, I think you're absolutely right. This epistemological change has to do with the death of God, of course. And you might even say that what came before Henry James and Machado de Assis was Darwin, That's where it really started.
Thank you, Paulinho, for your interesting talk. I was thinking about your basic opposition between 19th century fiction and pre-modern and modernist fiction. The opposition between clarity and completeness on one side and obscurity and absence on the other side. And I couldn't help thinking about Erich Auerbach, the first chapter of Mimesis. The Ulysses scar.
Ulysses versus the Old Testament.
The dichotomy between the classical style, which is all about clarity.
The biblical style.
Completeness, and the biblical style. It's all about obscurity and gaps and things not said. Somewhere else. And of course, you gave a very cogent explanation about the historical explanation about the difference between the two modes of the novel. But I was thinking that perhaps there might also be some kind of literary explanation, some kind of swing in the pendulum from from a more classical style to a more Judeo-Christian style in the terms of Auerbach? I don't know. Just
That's a good question. Kafka is definitely on the biblical side, yes. And in that aspect, you might say that, yeah, that seems to be a different way of looking at it. You might think of the ultimate realist 19th century mode, as exemplified in Tolstoy here, as the ultimate realization of the classical mood. Everything has to be clear. There's a light thrown on everything, with the profundity, of course, of the Judeo-Christian aspect. But it's more of a classical style, yes. And in the 20th century, what you get is a shadowy version of this, and the emphasis is on absences, on things that cannot possibly be told, things that can possibly be known. So in that sense, yes, though I don't think it's as separate as that. An interesting thing about Joyce is that he deals with much of the same material as Tolstoy in that sense. The amount of material that gets into the book, is very much like the nature of the material that Tolstoy gets into his novel. But when you compare, Tolstoy is describing a war that had immense consequence for Europe, and Joyce is talking about an absolutely uneventful day in the lives of an interesting, non-important people in a minor city of Europe, in an obscure corner of Europe. So that difference alone makes you think what's going on. I mean, what is so important about June 16th, 1904? What's so special about that day? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing special about that. So the very choice of that particular subject matter. Today, no, it's 13. 3 days ago. 3 days ago to Bloomsday. So I think that is already a difference, a major difference. Even though under a number of aspects, Joyce is closer to Tolstoy than the other examples I gave, Proust and Kafka. But in that sense, there's a big difference. I mean, he doesn't deal with historical big realities and big facts of history. He's concerned about entirely unimportant people in an entirely unimportant day. Like the Christian story, exactly. That's one of the major points that Auerbach makes. Now, the greatest story, or the most relevant in history, said in a very humble context and told in a very homely way by writers that have absolutely no literary goals or standards. So in that sense, yes, good point.
Wow. Thank you very much for such a fascinating talk, really. And my question is not about visual arts, guys, so don't worry about it.
Not about art.
Not this time. So, Paulo, would you say that the absence in Henry James' fiction, so the unsaid, the suggestions, is somehow related not to a moral purpose, but maybe to a decorum? Would that be a way to avoid vulgarity, explicitness, or perhaps to create a more elegant prose from James' views? What would you say on that?
Well, there is a sense in which the absences in James have to do with decorum, yes. But I don't think that's how it functions in his prose, even though you might say, okay, he's not explicit, he leaves a lot to the imagination of the reader, and in that sense, as Paul was saying, the work is, or to use Umberto Eco's phrase, it's more of an open work, so it can be read longer, people talk about it longer, it will become interesting for a longer period. Yes, but I think absence in James is really functional. It's there to make a point. The example that you gave, Beast in the Jungle, is a perfect example. I wonder I didn't think about that. Yeah, it's a perfect example. The whole story is about a person who is expecting something to happen, and then the person who is a concrete expression of this something that should happen dies, and then he realizes that it's been there all along. So there's a structural place held by the absence there, and this is, I think, is true of James that is not true in most other writers. Though of course you find others who also do that, but in James it's a structural thing. Everything turns around an absence. There's a center of gravity which is occupied by a hole. There's nothing there. There's somebody who is dead or something that never happened. And that's structural, I think, in the sense that it's not in other works.
Paulo, can you talk more about this relationship that you mentioned before between physics and art? Because that reminds me of a study conducted by Professor Peter Rollins, and then he compares Albert Einstein's relativity to James's works. He examines the Jolly Corner, and then he argues that both for Einstein and James, time is something connected to the position of the observer.
That's a good one.
And then he mentions Einstein when Einstein argues that time and space are free creations of the human intelligence, tools for thought, which are to serve the purpose of bringing experiences into relation with each other. And then when Spencer Brighton in the Jolly Corner left New York for Europe, the old world, as it had been for James in his youth, was for many the point of absolute reference. That was the point of reference in the domains of history, time, and culture. And then on their return, both James and Brighton had to confront the turbulence of a post-absolute world in which America, too, could be a reference body. So there is this change in time and space, considering Einstein and James. And then that reminds me also of an essay on Flaubert, one of the essays that James wrote. And then James says, someday or other, we shall surely all agree that everything is relative, that facts themselves are often falsifying, and that we pay more for some kinds of knowledge than those particular kinds are worth. So
that's really good. That's his text on Flaubert. Yes. Oh, I got to read that again. Beautiful, yeah. No, I really think that it's an epistemological change. It involved not just literature. Yes, it did involve physics, and curiously enough, the man responsible for the change of paradigm in physics never accepted the change of paradigm in chemistry. This is a curious thing. Einstein never admitted the idea that you cannot know a particle, everything about a particle, that it becomes, that the property of the particle that you're not examining at that particular point is simply no longer observable because it no longer is. Now that idea is absolutely repulsive to Einstein and to many people. Now, you can't accept that, okay, I can place this particle, I know exactly where the particle is in space, but I cannot know its speed at this moment. No. The point is, if you determine the place where the particle is, it no longer has a specific velocity. And if you determine the velocity, it is no longer in a specific place. Now, this is illogical. This doesn't make sense. But that's the way that chemistry has been going on for the past 100 years. So I think it's not just something to do with literature. It's something to do with the whole attitude towards reality. And of course, time. We think that in Kant, time and space are like basic properties of reality. Okay, and what we know now after Einstein is that, well, these are the two categories that we have with which to think about everything. But this does not mean that necessarily these things are part of reality. And So that's a big change. It doesn't seem like a big change, but it is. It's one thing to say this is the very stuff of reality, and it's something quite different. Says, well, this is how we can perceive the stuff of reality, but I'm not saying anything about reality itself. Here's that Kant made a distinction between reality as it is and what we can perceive. So the idea was already there in Kant, but somehow time and space were, well, no, these two things we cannot skip over them. We cannot conceive of them differently. And since Einstein says, yeah, why not? Time is relative to the position and the velocity of the observer. So it's a whole paradigm change, and it's not just in literature. It's in everything.
Any more questions? So thank you again, Paulo. Paul is there. Muito obrigado. I know you are a very busy man, and next week you're coming back to São Paulo again. You have
something I know about.
Yes, it's poetry. And again, hello. Thank you all it was a complete, for me, joy to be here and share ideas with you. So, and hear your own ideas, and that's so amazing. We could do that. So we are like the end, but not. We carry on to the next journey. I forgot completely the name in English of this journey. Okay, third, yes. So because I said that in Portuguese, so okay, that's the third conference. Yes, I found it here. Third International Conference on Henry James and the first symposium on the study of Realism and Modernism, an event organized by the Henry James Research Center. And we again thank the program and the Department of Literary Theory and Comparative Literature, CAPES, our funding agency, LERO, the Laboratory of the Study of the Novel, and you all. Thank you.